can you talk a little bit about how you came to reproductive rights and the law, how the book Personhood came about? I don't have my copy with me, but this is where I would hold it up and say, buy it. It's very, very good.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I kind of came to reproductive rights. I always cared about reproductive rights, but a lot of it was just sort of curiosity because I was in law school. I was taking a legal history course, and I'm going to wildly oversimplify here, but there was a fair amount in legal history of if you're a social movement like the reproductive rights movement, can you use the law to get what you want? Or is
Mm,
law sort of like a hollow hope? And we read a lot of books about the civil rights movement and the labor movement. And I was sort of waiting for, there had to be some kind of book I thought about the reproductive rights movement. I thought it was going to be the sort of like Roe as the cautionary tale about how
yeah.
law doesn't do what you want. And there was no book. So I went to office hours and I said to my professor, basically, what's up? Like, do you not like feminists? Like, what's going on? And he said, there really isn't such a book. All the books are about what led to Roe historically, not what
Mm,
happened after Roe. And so I was a nerd, so I just wanted to know. So I started going to archives and I started reading newspapers. And then I kind of found myself in this role of being one of the very few historians
yeah.
in this space. So
Yeah.
it started with just me being a feminist and me being curious and the information not being there. And then
Mm,
there's so much weird stuff that happens in history that once
yeah.
you start, one project kind of starts with another project. And how this idea of personhood came about, I remember after Dobbs, there was a lot of talk in the press. A lot of people would call me and say, "There's this new thing called fetal personhood," and oh my God, what does it mean? And I thought, well, it's not new at all. And then people were confused about whether the fetal personhood movement was this sort of fringe thing. It
Mm,
was like the far right, and then there was this sort of normal
yeah.
mainstream Republican Party anti-abortion movement, and that was wrong. So it was beginning to strike me that there were a lot of misconceptions that were really consequential misconceptions because
Yeah.
what the right is about right now, like the kind of new white whale, is fetal
Mm,
personhood. So if people either in the center or the left don't know what it is, that's a big
yeah.
problem, right? So I wanted to
Yeah.
write a book, and I also wanted to write the book because I thought um, I was fascinated by a bunch of polls that I began to see that would suggest some people saying things like, "I think life starts at conception, and I don't think abortion is a crime," or
Mm,
I think that children in the womb have rights, and I don't think abortion is a crime." And so I was also sort of wondering, how was it that we landed on this version of personhood that is pretty much just about punishment, right? Which is not how
yes.
every other country thinks of valuing life in the womb. And
Mm-hmm.
also how we got to a place where, we don't value life in the womb by valuing pregnant people, which is
Mm,
also weird, right? So I was sort of beginning to think, are there better ways to talk about fetal life that don't disrespect women, don't disrespect pregnant
right.
people? And part of that, I think, is figuring out historically how we got to where we are now, because
Right.
it feels inevitable, right? It feels kind of like this is the way it's always going to be. This is the way it's always been. And that isn't true. So that was the sort of hopeful, instead of the just, we're all screwed and we don't know how much kind of aspect of the history. There's also the sort of, there were different ways of thinking about this, and there still are different ways of thinking about this.
No, I really appreciated that about the book, and we need that sort of forward-looking hopefulness as well. Um, for those who might not know at all what fetal personhood is, can you sort of just explain the basic definition, and maybe talk about what it means tangibly when there are fetal personhood laws?
Sure. So, fetal personhood, obviously, in a lot of different contexts, it can mean a lot of different things. So, if you have a
Sure.
background, say, in like bioethics or philosophy, you may have heard this idea before, and it's not going to mean what I'm about to say. Legally, the idea of fetal personhood now mostly refers to the idea that the word person in the 14th Amendment applies the moment an egg is fertilized. And so the thrust of it is that voters don't get to decide that they want to have liberal laws on abortion or IVF or a variety of other things because the Constitution doesn't allow it. Essentially, those
Mm,
laws are unconstitutional. So, what the anti-abortion movement is shooting for is sort of like a Roe v. Wade for the right? Something that takes the issue out of popular politics and assigns it to the Supreme Court. Um, what it would mean is actually surprisingly contested because fetal
mm,
personhood has also been this sort of weird rallying cry for social conservatives for a long time, partly because it was vague, right? So it was this
mm,
sort of way of saying the real victims of discrimination in America are not women, are not people of color, are not queer people. It's the unborn. But then beyond that, they didn't really have to get into, okay, well, how do you enforce this anti-discrimination mandate? And what practically does it mean for things like the census? Like, a lot of that never had to be worked out because no one really thought fetal personhood was going to be a thing in the near future. And then Dobbs happened on a very accelerated timeline. So now we're starting to see a lot of these sort of like internal conflicts play out within the anti-abortion movement. So where are there sort of disagreements? There's some disagreements about whether recognizing fetal personhood would require IVF to just be completely criminalized or just transformed such that you could only create and
Mhm.
implant one embryo at a time. There are debates about whether you would have to criminally punish women and pregnant people. I don't really see, if you pin them down on it, it's very hard to explain how you wouldn't. If you
Yeah,
have this concept of personhood equals anti-discrimination and anti-discrimination equals criminalization, it's really hard to see how you exempt women from that. But
yeah.
there is a debate, as much as it's sort of a weird and not entirely persuasive debate. There's a debate about that too. Um, so there's a huge kind of Pandora's box element to this. Like the Adriana Smith case is an example of this. I think
Yeah,
some Republicans were genuinely surprised that their personhood law produced that outcome. Others weren't, but some of them were like, whoa, whoa, this isn't what we meant. But
yeah.
that's the nature of fetal personhood laws. Sometimes you open the lid to the box and all kinds of stuff comes out.
So you think so a lot of them really didn't expect some of this, or they couldn't have foreseen, or because they didn't think that it was going to happen, they didn't give that much thought to enforcement. I mean, watching the Adriana Smith case to me was fascinating, just watching the responses from anti-abortion groups, where
Mhm.
some of them, like you said, were really, really eager to distance themselves and said, the ban doesn't say that. This is just about intentional abortion. Whereas, a group like Susan B. Anthony, Pro Life America, said nothing, was completely silent, I imagine, because
Yep,
they saw how unpopular it was, right? Um, I mean, some of these groups had to know that this would be the outcome, and they sort of just didn't talk about it, right? Like they just didn't
totally.
want
Yeah.
to address it. Right.
Yeah, I think that groups have a lot more foresight into what they think fetal personhood is going to mean than Republicans.
Yeah.
I think a lot of
Yeah.
Republicans, fetal personhood was sort of a talking point. And
Right.
then I think so. I think the attorney general in Georgia was like genuinely, I got the impression he was genuinely taken aback by it, and also was undercut by other Republicans for saying, oh, no, totally. Like, this is what we were going
Yeah.
for. So I think
Yeah.
how much anticipation there is varies, but I think the common denominator is that um, they didn't have to fully flesh out where the points of agreement and disagreement were until recently.
Right.
So now they're
Right.
having a kind of very public fight about what it's supposed to mean that they never had
Mhm.
to have before. Because it was sort of a get out the vote tool, right? That you just have to, you'd have Republicans, like in 2018, Alabama had that fetal personhood amendment that got to be so important in the 2024 IVF case. Like nobody, I mean, Alabama already had all kinds of trigger laws and stuff. And
Yeah.
the only reason that went on the ballot was just because it was a way to get more Republicans to vote for other stuff.
Mm. In terms of the conflict or the disagreements that the anti-abortion movement is having over personhood, does most of it revolve around criminalization, right? And
Yeah.
criminalizing
Yeah.
patients and sort of like
Everybody's pro criminalizing stuff. It's just exactly what and how much. there's,
right. I
there's,
mean, it
that's not,
seems
yeah.
It seems to me that a lot of them, there was a quote from Kristen Hawkins, who's the president of Students for Life. She was on her podcast or a podcast, and she said
Mhm.
something to the effect of like there are three groups, within the anti-abortion movement. The group that doesn't want to see a patients criminalized ever, the group like the abortion abolitionists who absolutely want to see patients criminalized, and the group that most of us fall under. She said, which is like, yeah, we think that probably patients should be arrested, but we need to get the culture and the law to catch up. Basically, like we're not going to do it while it's quite so unpopular. Does that
Mhm.
sort of like jibe with what you've seen?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think within the people who don't want to punish patients, there's a divide there too. There's a
Mm,
subset of folks in the anti-abortion movement who genuinely don't want that. A lot of those are people who have family members who've had abortions. They're people who have
right.
had abortions, right?
Yeah.
And so there is a subset of people who really believe the like women are victims of abortion thing. Um, it's a talking point for most of them, but there are a subset of people who are genuinely worried about this too. So at the
Right.
moment, I think it's mostly being driven by politics. That's exactly
Right.
right. And there's also, I think, a hesitation to pull the trigger because the people in that kind of large middle group, it doesn't really sound like a middle group to me, but whatever, we'll call it that,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
are persuaded at the moment that sort of America hasn't had time to habituate itself to this idea, right? Because abortion was a right for
Right.
so long. So to make it kind of like cool and fair, we need to wait a bit. Um, which I mean is, and
Yeah.
there are also gradations about who they think should be punished, right? Like why are you having the abortion? How do you react to the abortion, right? So there's a lot of antipathy and anger about people who do abortion storytelling who are actively happy about their abortions, right? Or who are
Right.
taking abortion pills on the steps of the Supreme Court. Like that really makes people mad in the anti-abortion
Yeah.
movement. So you'll
Yeah.
sometimes see people saying, I don't want to punish patients, except for these patients, right? Like these
Right.
patients are really giving me the ick, and like that's where we got to go immediately. So there's a lot of exception drawing too.
I mean, that's absolutely wild. I mean, we know this, and obviously they talk a lot about intent, right? And that
Mhm.
abortion as an intention, if someone like really wanted to, or if someone was happy. And I think there was in West Virginia when that sort of county prosecutor was talking about arresting miscarriage patients for how they dispose of their
Mhm.
miscarriage remains. He said something to the effect of, well, it depends on how they were acting before they
Right.
miscarried. We're like, did they not want to have that baby? Like, just this sort of like focus on intent is so interesting to me because it just gives up the game that this is so much about how well you conform into being like a good woman, a good mother, and a good woman wants to have babies. And if you wanted to have babies, then that's okay. And you just, and just seeing them sort of reveal themselves, I think, has been fascinating around this.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, I think the people who have the most nuanced thoughts on it are people like the people in the they genuinely don't want to punish patients camp tend to be people who've had, like domestic and sexual violence in their families, right? Who sort of
Yeah.
realize that the dichotomy between people who want to have babies and don't isn't quite so black and white as they'd like it to be. But that's complicated for them too, which is why
Mm,
rape exceptions have started to go by the boards, right? I mean, that's one of the really I mean, it's driven by personhood for obvious reasons, right? I mean, if you equate a fertilized egg with like a 10-year-old, you don't get to kill the 10-year-old because the 10-year-old was conceived in rape, so therefore you don't get to have the abortion
right.
either. But I think it's prompted a lot of kind of justification or revival of justification of the idea that no one really needs exceptions for sexual assault in the first place.
Right. Where do you see that going? The sort of like trends with exceptions? Because it doesn't make any sense, right? Like, if you truly believe that a fetus, fertilized egg, embryo is a person, it doesn't make any sense that a rape victim um, would be able to obtain an abortion, or even maybe necessarily like a cancer patient. Like, how we know, like legislators think one thing, anti-abortion groups think another. Where do you see that going? Where is sort of it trending right now?
I mean, I think that the trend we've seen so far, which are these exception bills that don't actually do anything, is kind of where I see it going. And in
Yeah.
part, I think you see Republicans essentially recognizing that the unworkability of exceptions is a huge
Mm,
political liability. So they're trying to
mm,
kind of dig themselves out of that hole. Um, in particular, because even Democrats who are not comfortable with reproductive rights, like Joe Biden, make that a calling card, right? And they say, oh, look, in
mm-hmm.
these exceptional, really grotesque circumstances, they're still not allowing abortion. Um,
Right.
but then when they actually try to go and do anything with the exceptions, I mean, clarify them, expand them, anything, they find themselves often, because these are red states, being pulled further to the right by abolitionist factions in those legislatures or by just vanilla anti-abortion groups that don't want to broaden exceptions. So
Yeah.
usually the upshot is either that the exceptions in being clarified are actually narrowed, which is
Mm,
arguably what happened in
mm-hmm.
Kentucky and
Yes.
kind of in Texas too, or they're not clarified at all, right? So there's a sort of productive messaging exercise, I guess, for Republicans in the sense that some reporters just say there was an exceptions bill that was clarifying. But if
Hmm.
you dig into what the bill says, it's either clarifying in the sense of narrowing or it's not clarifying. I mean, and it's just, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think even if they want to clarify, it's just really hard to clarify what doctors can do with the language of criminal law. That's just, I think you're doomed.
Yeah.
You
No,
can't
I
do
think
that.
that's
That's
right.
not going to work, right?
No, anytime I see the word clarification, clarifying, coming up in a bill, I'm just like, "Oh, no, this is just gonna be a shit show." It's just terrible. I wanna talk a little bit about, like, the so-called abolitionists, but I wanted to get back to something that you write a lot about in the book and something that you mentioned earlier, around sort of language and what I see is like the co-opting of progressive language, feminist language, civil rights, right? Talking about fetuses, embryos, fertilized eggs as sort of a marginalized group.
Mhm.
Um, how did that come about, right? Sort of positioning embryos, fetuses as the most vulnerable among us. And how deliberate was it?
It was very deliberate. So
Yeah.
this was in the 1960s. So one of the arguments the book makes is that even though there's been an anti-abortion movement in the United States since the 19th century, it was in no way in the 19th century a constitutional rights movement. So
Mm,
the argument that the framers of the 14th Amendment were all about fetal personhood is hard to believe because even the anti-abortion movement wasn't about constitutional fetal rights in the 19th century. So it would be really weird if
right.
nobody was, but magically Congress was. That would be strange. So the movement for fetal constitutional rights got going in the 1960s around the time of the civil rights movement. At the time, it was a predominantly Catholic movement. Now, I think you'd argue it's at
Yeah.
least equally a conservative Protestant movement. Um, and the anti abortion movement was trying a lot of things to sort of forestall the reform of criminal abortion laws, initially just by adding exceptions. And
Yeah.
the traditional arguments had been, well, we can't reform abortion laws because then everybody basically it will just unleash the sluts and everybody will have sex with everybody. It'll be really bad. And
Right.
that argument wasn't working very well because the pushback from progressives that was finally working was, well, that's a moral judgment and moral judgments should be left to the individual. Um, it didn't help that in the 60s, there's a lot of anti Catholicism, right? So
Mm,
there were other people saying, do we really want the Catholic Church legislating
right.
morality for all of us? Um,
Yeah.
so then eventually you began to see Catholic anti abortion leaders saying, well, we can't make moral arguments because that feeds right into these choice conscience claims. We have to say that life begins at conception.
Hmm.
And what's more, we can't even say that people don't want abortion reform or that abortion reform isn't medically necessary. So why don't we just say people can't have abortion reform because it's unconstitutional?
Mm,
It's not an
hmm.
option because the Constitution protects the unborn.
Right.
So the argument came about then, and it was also really powerful because the anti-abortion movement at the time was really suffering because of progressive equality arguments.
Mm,
In part because then, as now, researchers were beginning to realize that the people who were harmed by criminal abortion laws were hugely disproportionately likely to be low income and hugely disproportionately likely not to be white. At the time, the only place you could get abortion was in private hospitals, and to do that, you had to have private medical insurance. And the
right.
vast majority of people of color were going to public hospitals; they didn't have that
Hmm.
option, and so abortion was, in some instances, becoming riskier for people
Right.
of color because they were still doing procedures at home in an era before mifepristone and misoprostol. So
Yeah.
to counter these equality arguments, you began to see anti-abortion groups saying, well, not only do we need to say this is unconstitutional because we're losing politically, we need
Yeah.
to say it's unconstitutional to say that we're on the side of equality, right? It's not the feminists, it's we're on the side of equality. And that argument in part made sense because sort of everybody at the time was saying we're the civil rights movement. Like if you think
Mm,
about any movement you can think of now, like
sure.
the early gay liberation movement, movement for indigenous peoples, movement for Latinx peoples, feminists, everybody was sort of doing we're the civil rights movement. So unsurprisingly, anti-abortion groups did too. But what was really interesting was that when they started, it really struck a nerve with a lot of conservatives. So when I think a lot of people expected when I started this research that it would just be, in public, folks talked about fetal rights. And then in private, they would just sort of like say, oh, no, we don't really care about that. This is just about women and sex. But when they're in private, they still talk about fetal rights. So this became
Interesting.
a way of like capturing all these ideas and feelings about sex and
Mm,
motherhood and whatever that really resonated with people and continued to resonate with people for more than 50 years. So it's one of these things that
right.
started as a complete expedient and then kind of like, depending on your perspective, mushroomed or metastasized into this whole
Yeah.
other thing that's still with us politically.
Craziness. How how does it work with the 14th Amendment, right? If legally fetal personhood is this idea that fetuses, embryos, fertilized eggs are people under the 14th Amendment, how does the law or the anti-abortion movement still claim that women are people under the 14th Amendment, right? Like you sort of can't have both, right? Like one has to trump
Mhm.
the other in certain circumstances. And so how do they negotiate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea again is the starting point that the way you do equality is by punishing people, which is a really weird way.
Yeah.
I mean, that was one of
Yeah.
the things that didn't start at the beginning, right? So at the beginning, anti-abortion groups, when they were doing this, were the real representatives of the disenfranchised. They would say things like, "Well, maybe we just need to get a lawyer for the unborn child," or maybe
Hmm.
some of them would even say maybe we need to mandate prenatal care, whatever. There were things that were less about criminalization, but by the 80s, when the anti-abortion movement kind of forged this partnership with the Republican Party, it became all about punishment, all about
Mm.
criminalization. And how they try to finesse this essentially is by saying, well, everybody gets equal criminalization. So if you're a woman and somebody murders you, they go to jail. And if you're a woman and you murder an unborn baby,
Yeah.
then you go to jail. So we all equally, nobody is going to help us with anything. No one's going to give us health care. No one's going to actually protect us from discrimination in our daily lives unless or until a crime is committed against us, in which case we get to see somebody go to jail. And that's the equality we get. So in
Right.
theory, then everybody is a person and our personhood is honored by punishing people, which, doesn't really sound that great for anyone in life. It's one of the
No.
reasons I think you'll see other countries saying, even if you think there's a right to life for a fetus, how are you helping honor that right to life just by punishing people? Like people who are on the fence and may say, well, I think I might want to have a baby, but I can't afford to have this baby. Or
Hmm.
maybe I want to have a baby, but I think there's just too much racism in my community for me to deal with. Like instead of
Hmm.
going to that person who may not want to have an abortion and helping them such that they feel they can have a baby, you're just saying, no, no, the whole idea is we're going to just punish the wrongdoing. It doesn't seem like it would work either, right? For people who, there are obviously lots of people who want to have abortions for whom abortion is a great thing. And then there are other people who are in crappy circumstances because we live in a country that doesn't do a lot for a lot of people. You could
Right.
probably reach some people by helping those in those circumstances, but that isn't. I don't want to say nobody because there are definitely people in the movement who are interested in doing that too. But overwhelmingly, the impulse is to equate equality with criminalization.
Right. If the criminalization was taken away, right? So like in the UK, they're voting to
Mhm.
decriminalize having an abortion. How much of the anti-abortion movement do you think would just like really move away from that? Would they be able to accept that as a whole if there was no criminalization of the pregnant person?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think they'd live with that for the moment. I
Yeah.
mean, they see that as a necessary political compromise. The impulse that
Mhm.
you can see manifesting in a lot of bills and laws that you've been talking about, Jessica, is just to criminalize like everybody else, right? So, okay, well,
Yeah.
you start with the doctors, and then what happens a lot of the time is
Yes.
that the doctors in a lot of red states just stop performing abortions as well as doing things like managing miscarriages because that's too legally risky. So then if you're unwilling to punish the patient a lot, obviously patients are still being punished, which pregnancy justice has documented
Yeah.
brilliantly. Not just for abortion, but for a whole bunch of other pregnancy related conduct, whether that's how you react to a miscarriage or using substances during pregnancy or whatever, right? But
Mhm.
if that's sort of like a smaller part of what you're doing because you don't want to own that you're punishing patients, then you
Right.
have to start trying to think of who else you can punish. So there's this ever wider net of accomplices, right? People who aid or abet in the language of the criminal laws. So, um, abortion funds, people who donate to abortion funds, internet service providers, websites. And I think there's been, and also a desire to get at doctors in other states, which is why there's so
Hmm.
much investment in finding ways around shield laws.
Mm.
Um, and that's a kind of endless. I mean, there's some mysteries that I have not solved, although I talk to people in the anti-abortion movement. I don't know why there hasn't been even more of that. I'm not sure if that's a
Mm.
political thing or a legal thing, but there's the impulse at the moment is to say if we're not willing to own punishing the patient, we just have to find a whole hell of a lot of other people to punish. And that
Right.
means projecting red state power into blue and purple states. And it also means, doing things that look potentially unconstitutional because they compromise the right to travel or the freedom of speech.
And that was literally going to be my next question, was about travel. How does personhood impact travel? Because a few months ago, I wrote about a bill in Montana where Republicans proposed that someone who traveled for an abortion would be guilty of trafficking their own fetus. We've
Hmm.
seen, Alabama's AG make some noise in a legal brief saying, "Oh, well, we're not restricting travel, but if we wanted to, we could, in the same way that we restrict travel or make a sex offender register with the state and let us know where they're going to be at, right? In the same way that the state
Hmm.
has an interest in protecting potential victims of sexual violence, we have an interest in protecting fetuses. Obviously, very, very unpopular. Um, but I'm actually surprised that I'm not seeing more of a fuss made when those things do come up. And so I'm wondering where you sort of see that going, or how popular talking about travel is in the anti-abortion movement and what they're thinking legally.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, the fixation is pills flowing into states, not people
Hmm.
flowing out of states. I mean, there's
Yeah.
definitely been some expansion. I mean, folks have probably followed the abortion trafficking laws, and the first gen abortion trafficking laws were all predicated on the idea that minors were being trafficked by adults who were
Hmm.
encouraging them to have abortions. uh, the real thrust is going to be that any travel for abortion is trafficking the fetus or unborn child, right? And there are already
Right.
some local ordinances that were created by Mark Lee Dixon and Jonathan Mitchell, who are the
Hmm.
architects of the Bounty Bill, SB 8, and a whole bunch of other. I mean, we were mentioning Matthew Kaczmarek early on the call. That's like sort of like a trio, like that gets together a lot to
Yeah.
do things. Um,
Oh,
but they're definitely more obsessed with shield laws.
yeah.
There's a lot more energy right now about pills flow, and I mean that makes sense, right? Because travel as a point of access for abortion really depends on where you live, right? So
Mm.
if you're in Missouri, the right to travel, or if you're in parts of Texas near New Mexico, the right to travel really matters to you. If you're in Georgia or something, you have to go all the way to Virginia. And for a lot of people, that's going to be insurmountable, right? So the
Right.
Southeast as a region is so homogenous now in the types of bans that it applies that the right to travel just doesn't have the same impact that
Right.
pills coming into states do. So I think that that's been much more a fixation at the moment, and there's a lot of throwing different things at the wall to see what will stick, from like taking the Comstock Act and having it used through state RICO laws to criminalizing internet advertisements, like in the Texas
Yeah.
mega bill that failed, to various kinds of like recriminalizing things having to do with pills over and over again in Louisiana in anticipation of like federal fights about whose law matters more. So I think we're going to see a fixation on pills and the mailing of pills
Yeah.
really until there's Supreme Court involvement, and maybe even after that.
Right. And the fixation on pills too, right? I had this conversation with Carrie Baker, who wrote a great book about abortion medication. That a lot of that has to do with something that you were talking about earlier. This idea that like women shouldn't be happy, or they should feel like a little bit of shame when they have an abortion. That the ability to have an abortion at home, away from a clinic,
Mhm.
like comfortable, without having to deal with protesters, without having to show
Mhm.
your face, that there is something that really rubs them the wrong way about that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, their biggest success as a movement arguably was abortion stigma. So if you look at polling from the 70s through fairly recently, right, you would have large consistent majorities saying, I don't think abortion should be illegal. But when you asked, is abortion moral? it was pretty much
Hmm.
evenly divided. There were lots of women in the 90s and 2000s and 2010s who would self-report a lot of shame, who would never have spoken about having an abortion. And that had a knock-on effect, right? People would often say, well, what's the difference between same-sex marriage and abortion in terms of evolution of popular opinion? And I always resisted that a little bit because
Yeah.
abortion rights have always been fairly popular, right? Going way back to the 70s. So I think there was a certain amount of overstatement about how divided we actually are about that. But to the extent there wasn't as much movement, I think it was because people just didn't know that they knew people who had had abortions. Like there was no
Yeah.
coming out of the closet with abortion as there had been with folks who were LGBTQ. And again, that was because of stigma. But it's a lot harder to have stigma when people are allowed to have abortions at home, right? When they don't have to go to
Yeah.
clinic, when there isn't this experience of having blockades and protesters and the prospect of violence too, right? I mean,
Yes.
that was always present. Um, so I think that was really, and just the reality of what abortion pills are like, right? I think there was
Mm.
always this a lot of messaging. If people think back to like partial birth abortion bans, right? The idea that like abortion is not like a thing that happens to you if you are a woman in your reproductive life, unless you do this intentional thing, right? It's not like
Yeah.
miscarriage, not like stillbirth, it's not like pregnancy, and people who've had pill abortions with mifepristone and misoprostol, it's hard for doctors to even tell if they've had a miscarriage or an abortion. And so a lot of people then experience that abortion as being not so dissimilar from something they almost certainly, like almost every woman of reproductive age has had a miscarriage at some point, right?
Hmm.
Um, so I think that's important too. Again, it makes it just much harder to stigmatize. So I think they see it as dangerous because it doesn't allow red states to enforce their own laws, because it undermines their ability to stigmatize abortion. Like all of that is tremendously threatening to the movement. And it really has been. I mean, they've been fighting abortion pills since the 80s. I mean, this has
Right.
been like a
And they haven't
problem.
had like so much success, right? Like the fact that like that abortion pills are still around, the abortion rate hasn't gone down. Given how terrible everything is, I would still say they've sort of been a failure in that regard,
Yeah.
in terms of, not being able to limit people's access entirely.
No, totally. I mean, I think that one of the reasons there's a sort of feeling of desperation to the way they've handled
Mm.
abortion pills because everything they've done has failed. And I think, again, I mean, I think a lot of their successes, I think fetal personhood is a really powerful argument, right? I think there are a lot of people who are in the middle who think, yeah, when I'm pregnant, I think that's a human being, right? That's a pretty good argument. I think when it gets complicated is when they get into brass tacks of like, okay, well, that means you can't have this pill anymore, or this person's
Right.
going to jail, or, I think one of the things you saw, I think, after Dobbs was there was a drop in support for abortion restrictions in places where abortion restrictions were in effect, right?
Right.
Like the reality of abortion restrictions, like if you ask people in the abstract, like, well, what sounds good to you? Is it like 20 weeks or 16
Yeah.
weeks? Or, it's like ordering Chinese food or something, right? You're like, oh, 20 weeks sounds better than, I mean, I don't think
Yeah.
people were really, and people are like, well, in the abstract, I think people should be able to like get it together by a week, blah, blah, blah.
Hmm. Hmm.
But then when you actually got into, well, like, who's having abortions at that point? And like, what is happening when you don't let them have abortions at that point? And who's going to jail? Then people were sort of like, whoa, wait a minute. So I think in general, they've had um, a lot more success with some of these like sort of abstract arguments, like
Right.
being pro-life, the
Yeah.
idea of exceptions, the idea of fetal personhood, than what those things mean in practice, which have often turned out to be unpopular. And they haven't always pivoted, right? I mean, there are people in the movement who have said, we really can't say to patients, hey, you have to have a baby and then not do anything for them, which has been what they've done
Mm.
essentially, right? To the extent they've offered state support, it's all been outsourced through conservative Christian charities, which of course could just say, we don't feel like doing it anymore. Like no one's obligating
Yeah.
them to do anything, setting aside all the strings that come attached to the aid. Like they're charities, like they don't have to do anything. So the government
Right.
is sort of saying, we're putting our thumb on the scale to say you have to continue this pregnancy, but not putting the thumb on the scale to say we have to support you after the pregnancy.
Right.
And I think it's recognized by some folks in the movement that that's kind of problematic, right?
Yeah.
But you don't see a lot of pivoting to change that.
No, a lot of language about supporting women and families, and a lot of talking points and messaging, but not so much action. Um,
Yeah.
I want to make sure we talk a minute about the abolitionist movement. I hate saying that and like pretending like that's a real thing that they can say. Because to me, it seems like they are gaining power. It seems like they have a really pretty decent local ground game
Yep.
politically.
Mhm.
Um, you know, I see sort of them being treated as these radical outliers, which in one way, like, of course they are, but also those bills, and for those who don't know, like the abolitionists are folks who are proposing equal protection bills that would essentially charge abortion patients with homicide, right? And those bills seem like they're getting more co-sponsors.
Mhm.
They're being talked about in much more a much more blasé way than they ever were. And so I'm just curious about your take, sort of how much sort of cultural power within the movement do you see them having? How worried are you about sort of the advancing of that kind of legislation?
I mean, quite, right? So I think on the one hand, like, I think this is a kind of, is the glass half full or half empty? So if you want to be less
Sure.
worried about abolitionists, you would notice that what they're proposing would be wildly unpopular, even by the standards of the anti abortion movement. And while the anti abortion movement, I think at the moment, is less concerned about proposing things that are wildly unpopular, it's still concerned about proposing things that are wildly unpopular, right? It's not completely disconnected from political reality. Why I think you should be concerned is, one, the abolitionist movement is really strong in Southern Baptist churches. That's where it was born. That's where it's
Yeah.
been growing. And Southern Baptist churches are more influential than ever in the anti-abortion movement, right? So we talked a little bit about how the early movement was Catholic. The movement now is this. I mean, if you think intuitively, like, where do I think of the anti-abortion movement as being powerful? You're going to think of
Sure.
like Louisiana, Texas. You're going to think about places with like strong evangelical populations. And so the Southern Baptist Convention has a huge abolitionist faction, and states that have strong Southern Baptist presences have the strongest abolitionist movements. I think it's also easy to be confused by how strong the abolitionist movement is if you only focus on equal protection bills. I think
Mm,
one of the stories of this legislative session is that a lot of the bills that are likely to pass or have passed have been reshaped by abolitionists. So, to take one
mm,
example, like Texas's abortion clarification bill, one of the fights that came up with, there's a 19th century Texas law that the abolitionists say you can use to go after patients, to punish them.
mhm.
And Democrats and doctors and even some anti-abortion folks said, well, no, that's not what that means. It's been superseded by all these other Texas laws that say you can't punish patients. And the abolitionists were like, okay, cool. If that's the way you want to go, we're not voting for this exceptions bill. We're taking all these
Right.
Republican votes and we're going to go home. And so they had to essentially put this thing in the bill saying, we are not taking a position on whether you and under Texas law at the moment can go after patients or not, which is incredible, right? And
Mhm.
that's not the story you hear. You hear a story about how equal protection bills are failing, but they don't
Yeah,
need to
exactly.
succeed, right? Abolitionists are having a huge influence in Republican caucuses, particularly because in a lot of places where these bans are appearing and not appealing, they're not appealing, is um, states that are essentially one party states, right? There is no way partisan control of the legislature in Texas or Missouri or Louisiana is going to go to Democrats like
Right.
ever in our lifetime, probably. And so that means the only threat to someone like Senator Brian Hughes of Texas is being primaried from the right. So
Mhm.
there is always this feeling of like, you can't do anything that's super duper unpopular on abortion because maybe that might backfire. But you also have to worry even more about these folks on your right flank who are almost always abolitionists. So
Right.
I think that's kind of more the story, that abolitionists are pulling the proverbial mainstream groups toward
Mhm.
them. And they're also doing it for two practical reasons. One, if a lot of people are taking abortion pills, and you're not going to punish them, it's really hard to stop people from having abortions, right? I mean, you can punish the internet service provider and the shield doctor and whatever, but all of that is really legally complicated. And punishing the patient who lives in your state is really not very complicated. So if you open the door to that, the abolitionists are saying it's game over. Like, we have a way easier time. We don't have to jump through
Right.
hoops and talk about the full faith and credit clause and choice of law and all these like legalese things nobody wants to think about. We just, go ahead and punish the patient. Like, case closed. there's also just the logic of it, right? Because if you're
Yeah.
serious that a fertilized egg is a person, it's really weird to say you systematically exempt patients from punishment. And I spoke with a guy named Josh Craddock, who's one of the kind of legal
Hmm.
theorists of personhood, and he said, well, yeah, maybe you can kind of do it because we don't punish everybody equally. Like if you kill a cop, maybe you get punished more than if you kill somebody else, or if you kill a child or
Right.
something. But I said, well, but you don't systematically not punish anyone for killing a specific category of person. And he's like, yeah, maybe you couldn't do that. Maybe you
Hmm.
couldn't do that. And so, and he's not an abolitionist. So I think
Right.
the group of people who kind of recognize that you will probably eventually have to punish patients is
Hmm.
much bigger than the abolitionists. The abolitionists are more kind of like open about it and extreme
Right.
about it and more entirely talking about scripture about it. They also tend to be very anti-IVF. There are a lot of them protesting outside of
Right.
IVF clinics too.
Right. And just more explicitly misogynist, it seems to me. Like they're all misogynist,
Yeah,
but I mean, really sort of like loudly and proudly misogynist. I think it was Brian Hughes, right? We ran a video where he was talking about, an equal protection bill, and he sort of likened it to spanking your kid, right? Like charging abortion patients with murder, charging women with murder is sort of like spanking your kid. You don't want to do it, but you have to teach them right from wrong. There was this
yeah.
real.
There's definitely more gender traditionalism. Jason Storms, who runs Operation Save America, would run like these I guess they were like manliness camps where like men would go and
Cool,
like
right?
learn hand-to-hand combat and like their catchphrase was, when men are men, America will be great again or something. And so there definitely is more kind of overt gender traditionalism. A lot of anti-abortion groups have that obviously in the background, but the in the
Hmm.
foreground it's just this is a single issue movement, right? That's
Right.
fading away some because a lot of the groups leading it, if you think of groups that you've heard of lately, it's probably like groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom, which are explicitly
Yeah.
Christian and also working on lots of other issues. So seemingly like every Supreme Court case nowadays. I mean,
Yeah.
not entirely right, but I mean the trans rights case from the day before yesterday is an Alliance Defending
Hmm.
Freedom case. Like pretty much everything kind of vaguely
Yeah.
feeling like it has to do with social issues is an Alliance Defending Freedom case. So the gender traditionalism's always there, but I think with respect to the abolitionists, it's like front and center in a different way.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I want to make sure that we have some time for questions, and we've already gotten a few. And actually, this question leads in well to what you were just saying. Michelle wanted to know about the connection that exists between sort of the attacks on trans rights and the attacks on abortion rights. And you mentioned Alliance Defending Freedom. I'm just wondering what you're noticing. Does personhood come in there
Mhm.
at all, or is it just the same players? Obviously, a lot of this is about bodily autonomy and rights in that regard. But yeah, I'm wondering what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I think the common denominator, which is a huge thing, especially for groups like ADF, is this conservative Christian rooted view of what sex means, right? That sex is rooted in biological difference. So the arguments about sex discrimination you see in Dobbs, right? That there's no sex
Mm.
discrimination because, it's just about pregnancy and pregnancy makes us different. So if we discriminate on that basis, it's all good. That's kind of the logic you saw ADF using in Scrimeti, the trans rights case, essentially saying, well, you're not really discriminating against trans people, you're just recognizing biological differences. And this
Right.
is something groups like ADF root in scripture, like they will quote scripture about this, and then say this is kind of what the Constitution reflects because they think the Constitution reflects Christian teachings. And this is what our case law should reflect too. Obviously, the court is not saying all the stuff I just said about Christian teachings, but
Sure,
there
sure,
is
sure.
obviously a through line between, abortion case law like Dobbs and Geduldig versus Ayala, which was this foundational case saying you can discriminate against people because they're pregnant because bodies are different. What Reva Siegel famously, my colleague and co-author, called "Reasoning from the Body," all the way through to
Mm.
Scrimeti yesterday. And it's interesting because I think one of the things I'm writing about now is just groups like ADF really didn't know what the hell to do with trans rights for a long time. Like now it seems like, oh, they've this brilliant backlash to trans rights that they've engineered, but they really weren't very good at it in the mid 20,
Yeah.
like 2016, 2017, 2018. So I think it's worth remembering that this is not some sort of like, well, of course progressives were going to lose this. They weren't losing it for a long time until ADF figured out this plan. The other commonality is you will hear protecting women a lot in both contexts, right? We
That's
need to
exactly what I
protect
was going to say.
women
Yeah.
athletes, we need to protect women in locker rooms and bathrooms, and we need to protect women from abortion. And in both cases, the what are you protecting them from is sometimes not just trans people, but also this sort of industry, right? There's this description of
Mm,
like
yes.
trans inclusive medicine is this like evil profiteering industry, just as there's big abortion, which they say is a big industry. So there's been a lot of strategic borrowing over time.
Right. Big industry. One of the things I wrote about, and I need to start covering it again, is the way that some anti-abortion folks were going after prenatal testing, right? And I
Hmm.
have noticed this sort of shift in language where they're talking about prenatal testing as this huge, billion-dollar industry that's trying to
Yeah,
take advantage of women as a way to put restrictions on prenatal tests to stop people
totally.
from finding out, if they have some sort of fetal abnormality. That terrified me the first time I
Totally.
saw
I mean,
that.
look at what they say about they now call IVF big fertility, right? So there's like big
Right.
fertility, big abortion, so it's the same playbook again. And I mean, I feel like they're starting to do that with contraception too, but I haven't seen the same talking points other than the
Right.
slippage with, it turns out all contraceptives are secretly abortifacients, but that's so maybe you don't need to because it's just big abortion anyway, right?
It's surprising to me how open they are about that attack on contraception. And sometimes I get frustrated because I feel like we don't talk about it enough, or mainstream press doesn't talk about it enough. Like every time I see Kristen Hawkins or Students for Life quoted in an article, I'm like, why aren't you talking about the fact that on their website they say that they want to ban contraception? Like they really are being very bold
Hmm.
about this idea that they think certain kinds of contraception, I mean, really any kind of contraception that isn't a barrier method, I think, or like the rhythm method is an abortion to them. Yes.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I was surprised by that too. I think like one of the reasons I'm working on a project now is because having studied the history of this for as long as I did, like there was a lot of money and effort that went into saying we, the anti-abortion movement, are not opposed to contraception, and we're not like
Mm-hmm.
Anthony Comstock, where we're anti-sex, and we don't like really care about trans rights. Like none of that. That's just not. We're
Yeah.
like the civil rights movement for the unborn. So to see the movement now saying, actually, just kidding, like we do care about trans rights and we don't like contraception, and like it tells you something important has changed, right? Because
Right.
it hasn't always been this way. So it's worth sort of thinking about why is that happening? And I think in
Right.
part that's happening because anti-abortion groups are not talking to voters a lot of the time. They're
Mm,
talking to federal judges. And, Clarence Thomas is cool with all of that stuff, right? I think
right.
for a long time, the pivot was if you go back to personhood, in the Republican Party platform, there used to be a call for a constitutional amendment on fetal personhood. What would that
Mm-hmm.
require?
Right.
Supermajority support from voters. Now, the kind of coded reference in the 2024 platform is screw that. We already have fetal personhood in the Constitution, and all we need
Right.
is 5 justices on the Supreme Court to say that. That puts you in a
Right.
very different position in terms of embracing unpopular politics because you're not talking to voters, right? You're talking
Right.
to like Sam Alito. And, as much
Right.
as he's representative of all of our, no, I'm kidding. He's not, he's a very different kind of dude than, some of us maybe.
But they're also just making clear that they don't care what voters want, right? Like every
Yeah.
reaction to these ballot measures, to states where voters have quite literally tried to codify protections for abortion rights. They've been like, no. So it seems to me that totally agree. They're just sort of getting further and further away from caring about what voters want.
Yeah. And they're
Um,
totally comfortable saying that too. I mean, they would say they're a human rights
right.
movement. And if voters don't like human rights, then oh well, right?
Right. I mean, literally every quote from an abolitionist says something to that effect. Another Jessica asks, who's in the conversation, wanted to know. I had mentioned a class action lawsuit. I think it was in New York that was brought on behalf of fetuses. Does that mean that under personhood, someone could sue a fetus? Like, how far does that go under legal fetal personhood?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is probably not, but who knows, right? Again, because
Mm,
nobody really worked this out. There's some other absurd kinds of scenarios. There was a woman in prison in Florida for murdering someone, and her attorney sought to have her released from prison by filing a
I
petition
saw
on
that.
behalf of the fetus, right? So, I mean, I think that,
Yes.
I mean, if what we mean by personhood is just that a lot of people go to jail for things that result in some sort of harm to fetuses or embryos, then probably not. But
Hmm.
who knows, right? I mean, I think that no one has really worked any of this out beyond those basic things.
Right. I want to make sure to ask you this. We only have a couple of minutes left, so if anyone has any last questions, please feel free to chime in, ask. Since I mentioned ballot measures, something that has been this sort of like point of
Mhm,
contention within the abortion rights movement is language around viability.
mhm.
Isn't viability or codifying protections just up until viability, which we know is not like a real medical term? Isn't that also a form of fetal personhood?
Yeah, I mean, arguably, right? I think
Yeah.
again, if you think that personhood is about criminalizing something at a certain point in pregnancy, it is.
Right.
Um, I mean, it's complicated in the sense that I'm sympathetic in some ways to people who live in red states. I grew up in Montana. I spent a lot of my I spent prior to living. I now live in the Bay Area. I am in Sausalito,
Hmm.
so this is like not a very red place at
Very,
all. But
yeah,
prior to that, I lived in the Florida Panhandle, and prior to that, I lived in Missouri. So I understand the people who are saying, yes, viability may be fetal personhood, but it's better than nothing. It's a
of
complicated
course, yeah.
debate, right? But I do think that it does reinforce the idea that at a certain point in pregnancy, criminalization is okay. Um,
Hmm.
it also captures the reality that I think some people in the middle do think of pregnancy differently as pregnancy continues, right? Which is one of the reasons folks in the anti abortion movement have really struggled. So they would sort of start with, okay, let's focus on viability because
Hmm.
people are uncomfortable with abortion after viability. But it turns
Right.
out even the people who are uncomfortable with abortion after viability really are not uncomfortable with abortion most of the time early in pregnancy. So it doesn't
Yeah.
translate in either direction. But yeah, I do think it's probably fair to say it's at least
Yeah.
aligned with fetal personhood, if not a full blown, because I think really
Right.
full blown fetal personhood is from fertilization. So
Right. Is from fertilization. And I appreciate it. And for folks who are watching, if you haven't bought the book Personhood yet, you absolutely should. You sort of um get into this idea that sometimes the pro-choice movement is a little bit too distanced, maybe, from people's lived experience of pregnancy, the way that we talk about it, because there's this fear of bringing
mhm.
personhood or humanity into pregnancy at all because we're afraid of giving ammunition to conservatives. So I really appreciated that you sort of, brought all of that up and tried to make that conversation a little bit more nuanced. I wanted to, Dawn, that's the question I was looking for. Dawn wants to know, what should states do to protect against establishing personhood and associated laws? And that's actually, I was going to ask, if people are worried about personhood in their own states and their own communities, what should they sort of be on the lookout for other than sort of the obvious equal protection abortion is murder bills, right? Because we've seen legislation that's like child support from conception, right? Like, what are
Yeah.
the different things that people can sort of be on the lookout for?
I mean, there's a really helpful document called the New North Star document that a lot of
Mm,
anti-abortion groups put together that lays out all the kinds of laws they want to use to recognize fetal personhood. So this includes laws about wrongful death, child support, limiting how IVF is
yeah.
practiced. It's not exhaustive, but it's a good starting
Mm,
point if you're looking for things to watch out for in your state. And I think it's also helpful, just if you're talking about personhood in your state, to call it criminalization, right? I mean, and also to have ways of saying,
mm,
if we were serious about this concept that this fertilized egg is a person, great. Like, what do we do to improve the odds that if this person wants to be pregnant, they don't have a miscarriage or a
yeah.
stillbirth? Like, if we're actually serious about this, like, what would that look like, right? Like, if we actually cared, what would that look like? And talking about those kinds of laws, because it probably wouldn't
Hmm.
look like the kinds of laws you're going to see, right? And I think that's
Right.
helpful too, because people who are people who are confused. One of the things I found the most powerful, if you go into the archives, where you find the most nuanced discussions of fetal life often are people who've had abortions or people who provided abortions. These are people who are the most
Mm,
comfortable being like, look, the way people feel is
yeah.
messy. Like, it's okay. Um,
Yeah.
so I think sitting with that and acknowledging that is helpful because there are people who are not plugged in, who don't really care about this issue on a day-to-day basis, who don't want people being criminalized, right? And talking to them
Hmm.
and saying, this is not about, like, if you want to believe that life begins at conception, awesome. If you want to believe that when you're pregnant, that's your baby, fantastic. Like, no one's quarreling with that. They're just saying that it
Yeah.
doesn't follow from that this, that, and the other person should all go to prison. Which I
Right.
think is really and that's really the problem. I mean, people can believe whatever they want, and a lot of people who support abortion rights believe a lot of those things, and that's all okay.
Yeah.
Like, you don't need to fight with that. I think it's more what that means for how we treat one another in really harmful ways, right? I mean, that ways that make patients' lives infinitely more dangerous, make pregnancy infinitely more, like, that's where we have the problem, right? It's not what
Yeah.
people are thinking in their heads up until that point.
Exactly. I had a conversation. I did a live stream with Dr. Shelley Sella last week,
Mhm.
who is a former, third trimester abortion provider, and she said something very similar, which is you can think whatever you want. You can think it's a human. You can think that you would never do this. You can think that it's wrong, but where it stops is, criminalizing someone else for a choice that you wouldn't make. I want to make sure to let you go. I know that you are very busy, but before you do, can you maybe say a couple of things about what is giving you hope right now? I feel like there's a lot happening. Anyone who works on this issue is overwhelmed, whether it's a legal trend or just on a personal level. Anything that sort of keeps you going to do this work.
I mean, I think the results of ballot measures really surprised me, right?
Mm,
So I remember when Dobbs came down, Nate Cohn at the upshot at the New York Times had the sort of like, this is what percent of people in each state support abortion rights.
mhm,
So the assumption was, well, if you put a ballot measure in Missouri or whatever, you would know the result, right? The red states
right.
would reject the ballot measures and the blue states wouldn't. And it turns out that that just isn't true, and that criminalization is really unpopular on the ground. And that gives me hope because I think a lot of people, when they see what it means in practice for people they know and love, they're bothered by it. So there's,
Yeah.
despite some concerning things like the growing gender gap on abortion rights, I think there has been some evidence of this when reality sets in, people saying maybe not. And that gives me hope because I think, again, it's very different to debate these things in the abstract than to see them in practice. And so I think
Mhm.
that's something people who support abortion rights need to keep kind of pressing on, right? Like, as much as this may feel, it is an issue of equality and inequality. It is an issue of privacy, but it's also just sort of what happens when you do this stuff. Like, what does the reality of that actually look like? And people who in the abstract may say, well, I think feminism is kind of lame and I like Joe Rogan, or I don't really care about equality at all, or whatever. Then when you say, okay, well, if you don't care, this is what it actually looks like, then they're like, whoa, no, I'm not into that. So I think getting
Right.
into the nitty gritty is really important and something that I think has been powerful and probably will continue to be.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Thank you so much for chatting with me. Thank you to everyone who joined for the conversation. I am going to send out the video to the whole list, and I'll make sure to include a link to Personhood. If you haven't bought it, you absolutely should. And you can follow Mary on Blue Sky, on Twitter, Instagram also,
Yeah, kind of. I'm like, I
kind
am
of.
inept. I was telling you that my being on like on Instagram to try to talk about repro rights with Playboy. I don't know what the hell I'm doing with Instagram. So unless you're here to offer me vegan baked goods, I would not follow me on Instagram.
Listen, some people like vegan baked goods.
No, I'm here for it. If you want to contact me about that, please follow me on Instagram.
Amazing. Thank you again. Please feel free, come back anytime. It was so great, so illuminating. And thank you for all of the work that you're doing.
I'd love to come back anytime.
Excellent. Bye, everyone. Have a good night.
Okay, bye everybody.